The data security lifecycle is a tool to help us model our security controls as data moves in and out of different phases in its life in different locations and is in different states. We'll start by describing how to use the lifecycle, how to actually get security benefit from it, and use it to help model your controls. Then we'll introduce the lifecycle itself, which talks about the different phases data can live in. From there, we'll talk about the impact of locations and access on the life cycle, which is where cloud really starts to play a role. Then we'll talk about modeling the functions, access, and the security controls that we can put into place. From there, we map the life cycle back to those functions. We can use this potentially to build an entitlement matrix and then use that to help model the security controls. Sounds a little complex, but it's actually fairly straightforward once we walk through it. The data security lifecycle can be kind of confusing. So, we want to give you a little bit of advice on how we recommend you can go ahead and use that. Now, when you use the data security lifecycle, it's not meant to be used very granularly. You're not meant to model everything in your environment and match it to the life cycle. The life cycle is more about having a thought process. Understand where your data is, where your data moves, how you access it, and what the various exposures are. Are you worried about your cloud provider being able to access the data, your users, the public? And when you have those exposures, where can you put a security control in place? So as we get into this, you'll see that the focus of it is if we look at the different phases of where our data lives, and data moves around those phases, it's not a linear cycle. But as we look at those different phases, there's different kinds of exposures that can occur. And we want to look at what's possible and what we want to allow. And if you want to allow less than what's possible, that's where you need to insert a security control. That's all this is meant to do. Get you thinking about your data, get you thinking about the different phases that it goes into, and give you a little bit of help in terms of modeling where those security controls will come into place. There are a variety of ways of modeling how data is used within your organization, such as information lifecycle management. But when we looked at those models, they didn't really apply very well for modeling security controls, which is why we came up with the data security lifecycle. So let's go ahead and walk through the phases. Now, at some point, we have to have a start, and that's where we actually go ahead and create the data. From there, that data is going to be stored someplace. Could be stored on a hard disk, it could be stored with a cloud service, doesn't matter. We'll get to the locations a little bit later. Then, after data is stored, it's very likely used. So, this is where we integrate it into our applications, or we do processing with it, or we use that to make business decisions. From there, it's possible that we might go ahead and share that data, exchange it with business partners, with customers, cloud providers, and others. At some point, it's likely that we're going to go ahead and archive that data for backup and business continuity purposes, or just for longevity or compliance requirements. And in some cases, we'll want to go ahead and destroy that data, either just to free up space or again to meet either policy compliance or regulatory compliance. Now, the life cycle doesn't necessarily move through these strict phases. Although we show it with an arrow going around, that's just for visual presentation. Practically speaking, data moves in and out of all of these phases at various points in time. So we could create our data and store it and then immediate share it, or go ahead and then immediately archive it. Occasionally, we may destroy the data, but that may only be copies of the data. So really, we've simplified things because these are the phases where we can actually go ahead and model the security controls because they're going to be different during those different phases of the life cycle. But it's not necessarily a strict life cycle that starts with creation and ends with destruction. The life cycle itself does a good job of describing the different kinds of phases data can live in, but it doesn't give us a good sense of where the data is stored, or how the data is accessed. And those are two aspects that are probably, in many cases, going to most dramatically affect security controls. Because what it turns out is we take our data and we move it between a lot of locations. And it's not like there's just only one copy of our data. There can be, at times, multiple copies of our data in multiple locations being used differently. That's where this next graphic comes into place. And the idea is we can go ahead and be able to model how that data is actually accessed and where that data is stored. So we can have data in internal private clouds or public clouds. We can have data that is accessed directly from a device off the central network, or that can require us to go through the central network, such as a VPN, or to be on premise to access that data. And in some cases, we may have devices such as tablets or phones accessing data directly in an external public cloud service. And that could be from on-premise network to our exterior networks. And so it's really important to have an understanding of where are we storing the data and how does data move between those different locations, and how does data move between those different phases, because that's where we can figure out where our security controls need to be put into place. And in a moment, we're going to talk about taking it from this more visual modeling into how can we actually go ahead, write it down, and get a sense of where to put security controls to ensure that our data is only where it should be. But the main point we want to get across in this part of the training is that it is pretty important to go ahead and be able to model and know where your data is, when it moves from on-premise to cloud, when it moves between the different cloud services, when it moves between different cloud providers, as well as how is it being accessed? Is it being accessed by client devices like most of what you see on this slide? Or is it being accessed by servers? Or is it being accessed by other cloud services? That's all part of modeling our data flow and feeding that right into the lifecycle to evaluate the security controls. We started by describing the data security lifecycle, which is a good way of modeling the different phases data can live in, from being shared to archived or even destroyed. Then we talked about the locations where data can be, as well as how that data can be accessed. Now we need to get into the nitty gritty about what can be done with that data and who can do it. That brings us to functions, actors, and controls. Now, there's different kinds of functions, different things we can do with that data. Somebody can access that data, they can process that data, and they can store that data. We can think of that as the read, execute, and write of data in the cloud. And those allowable functions are going to change based on the location the data is in and based on the user. And the controls that we use to actually determine what is allowed and not allowed are also going to be different based on who the user is and based on what the location is. And we do tend to find that people have different security policies based on where data is, which is frequently they're going to have different policies based on what is internal versus external. And we have to model all of this in the face of having multiple data security life cycles, because that data is not going to exist potentially in one place. So here's what that looks like. So if we take our data security life cycle, and in this case, we're just going to look at data as it's being stored. Well, once that data is stored, we want to be able to put controls in to define who can be allowed to actually access that data and what the different kinds of functions we want to allow for those users, such as who can access the data, who can process the data and make changes to it versus just reading it, and who can store the data, who can write it either in the same location or make changes to it or move it to another location. Now, for that particular piece of data in that location, we're going to have a list. Who can possibly do things to it, such as you and your cloud provider, and who do we want to allow to be the only ones to say access that data? And maybe that's only your own employees. And the same thing for storing it, and the same thing for moving it into other locations. What are the places where it can possibly live? What are the places we only want to allow it to live? And the lines in between those are the security controls. That's how we actually go ahead and make the determination of when we need to put a control in. Because if something is more possible than we want to allow, the only way to prevent that is to put a security control in place. Let's make this a little more practical. Imagine you have data, it's stored in your cloud provider. Your cloud provider can potentially access it, the actors, and your own employees can potentially access it, and you only want your employees to access it. So the security control that you put in place could be encryption with a key that only your own employees have access to, which knocks that list of who can possibly get to that data down to only your employees. This is simply another view for what functions are possible during which phases of the data security lifecycle. For example, if we look at create, store, use, share, archive, and destroy, well, in all of those cases, looking at the data is possible. But only in create and use do we actually have processing of that data. And only in store and archive do we actually have storage of that data. So this isn't a way of modeling your security controls. All we're showing here is which of the functions are actually even available during which phases of the life cycle. And as you'll see, for certain phases, some of the functions aren't even possible, and we don't have to worry about modeling those. The end result of this is we should be able to go ahead and map what looks very similar to an entitlement matrix, where we list out the functions, the actions, the locations. We list out what's possible and what should be allowed. And as before, in our more visual diagram in this grid view, you can imagine that those gray lines in between possible and allowed is where we have to put in a security control if we want to allow or deny a particular action. Now, this is going to vary as well based on who the users are. So it can be a little complex, but at the core, we generally want to start with the higher level functions without even necessarily thinking about who all of the users are, who the actors are. And then we can start to narrow that down and we can use versions of this in different use cases. Where the high level is what's fundamentally possible, where the actual entitlement matrix we use to build our security controls in the cloud provider is what is more practically possible and based on that location and based on those users.